Hello, YouTube. Hello, YouTube, indeed. And welcome to some surprise bonus content. This one is going to be a long one, but I really wanted to make this video. I just woke up this morning with a need to make it, so I hope it's going to go down well. I want to take some time to talk about pros and cons of some of the common things that we use in miniature painting. I could do a similar video to this for 2D painting, but I tend to find that 2D painting just it's not as much of a divided world. People just kind of paint with what suits their style and make it work for them. With miniature painting, there tends to be a lot of argument over what's good, what's bad, what's value for money, what's well made, what isn't, what lasts a long time, that kind of thing. I see these arguments constantly on social media, and so I really just wanted to address some of the popular things, talk about what's good and what's bad about them to allow people to make some maybe slightly more informed decisions based on the experiences of someone who's been in the hobby for a very long time. I've been painting miniatures for since about 1992. So, you know, I feel like whilst I may not be an authority on the subject, I've at least had a hand in most materials. We're going to switch over to some face cam footage with a screen share now, so you can take a look at me having a natter away, first of all, about paints. Alright, so let's first of all start talking about paints. I know this is a bit of a new weird layout for you, but I think for informational purposes it's nice that you can kind of see me and see what I'm talking about, so let's not waste any time, let's get into it. First of all, the most common paints that you're going to encounter both as a miniature painter, and I think generally if you're into any sort of niche hobby painting, even the magic altruists out there are probably going to be very familiar with these, is your Games Workshop paints. So, let's see, pros. The main pros of the Games Workshop paints, they are very, very readily available. They have a vast range of colours. And there are a ton of information resources on how to use them. All really good stuff. But everything comes with a con. So what are the cons of the GW paints? Well, my biggest issue with the GW paints is I don't particularly like how satiny they are. They tend to... I paint in a lot of very, very thin layers. And I find that the more you paint that way, the more satiny they finish, to the point where they almost look a bit plasticky on the miniature. I also think they're a bit pricey for the quality of the paint. I don't think they thin very well without splitting. They tend to want to start separating as you get into making glazes with them and stuff like that. They can just be a little bit hard to handle compared to other paints. But overall, GW paints are a good paint. If you don't mind spending the money, I mean, $3.70 for, what is it they make these days, a 12mm? Is it a 12mm? I think, yeah. So £3.70 for a 12mm of metallic is quite a lot of money for 12mm of paint. So if you don't mind spending the money, I think GW paints are okay. And that's kind of, I think, why they do so well. I think that's a lot of the reason why GW paints are the dominant paints on the market, as it were. However, there are alternatives. The main one you may have heard of is Vallejo. Vallejo is actually, it's the colour range that I tend to use the least, and really weirdly, just recently, I've been wanting to pick some up. The main place I tend to find is easiest to pick up Vallejo is if you look on Amazon for these sets. If you need individual bottles, then you're probably going to look at going to, you know, local game stores that stock them. I know that there's one very popular game store that stocks them. However, for purposes of picking up your first sort of dip into Vallejo, I tend to find that these sets on Amazon are the best way to go. In 40 quid for, what is this, 8, 16, 17mm pots. So, I mean, what does that work out to? What does that actually work out to? Let's do the math live. So we're paying $39.99 and we're getting 16 bottles. That's $2.49 for 17 mils. So you work your price out as compared to GW. then you're in for some serious savings. And when you buy these in individual bottles, they're not a ton more than this, I should point out. We'll just quickly look for individual bottles here. You see $2.55. Obviously you are going to pay shipping here on the whole order, but that's true of anything that you buy off the internet. But yeah, you're talking similar prices, and they are 17ml bottles. Now, pros, obviously, very affordable. Vallejo paints are extremely affordable. They're also very, very good for coverage. In fact, I find them too good for coverage for most of the painting I do. That's one of the reasons I rarely use them. The coverage is actually too high for a lot of the painting that I do. Because I do so much with layers and transparencies, they actually don't work for my style of painting. So that's something to bear in mind. Cons, honestly, with Vallejo, there are not a ton of cons. I'm going to be honest. The only pain in the arse is that obviously buying individual bottles online is a bit expensive, and committing to buying sets is a bit expensive as well. You know, committing to laying out 40 quid for 16 bottles of paint might be a problem for you. Some of the colours can have that plasticky problem like GW, but that is true of a lot of miniature paints, and a lot of miniature painters have kind of learned to work around that by this point, so I can't really consider that a con. Let's go for my next alternative, Reaper Miniatures. Now these are actually the main paint brand that I use for painting miniatures. When I'm painting 2D, I use strictly gold and fluid acrylics, but I am going to focus this video on miniature paints, and miniature tools in general. So I would say pros of Reaper Master Series, first of all, they have the most beautiful matte finish, and that is one of the things that I really love about them. They are so matte. However, not to that point of being dusty, and I'll get on to talking about that in a minute. They are exactly at that peak point of being matte, where if they were any more matte, you wouldn't like them, but they're just bang on. And that allows you to really create realistic luster based contrasts. So for example, what I like to do is I'll get a satin varnish, and I'll paint, say, a pair of brown trousers and a pair of brown boots in very similar colours that don't contrast very well, but then I'll hit the boots with a satin varnish, so the trousers are really, really matte because I've used those Reaper paints, and the boots have got that satin to them that makes them look like leather. It's a really, really nice little contrast. So big advantage with Reaper. The matte finish is beautiful. They are also, so people call them pre-thinned. That's a really silly phrase to use. They're not pre-thinned. They have a lower viscosity. It's not the same thing. When you thin a paint, you are lowering its viscosity whilst dispersing the pigment. Okay, so the more you thin a paint, the less pigment there is per part. Reaper paints still have a very high yield of pigment per part. They are ready to use. However, they are a lower viscosity. I find that actually helps because it means that generally by the time I've put it on my wet palette and then dipped a damp brush in it to start work, I'm usually at painting viscosity without any need to faff around. So actually Reaper's out of the bottle viscosity for my painting style, very, very useful. But if you are someone who paints with thicker, drier paints, not going to be so great for you. So for me, pros are the matte finish and the viscosity. There's also a massive range. You cannot begin to appreciate how big the Reaper color range is. This is just one of their ranges. This isn't even the full thing, and you can just scroll for weeks. It is ridiculous, and there are some beautiful colors. These neons and stuff like that, fantastic. So there is a reason why Reaper are one of the main paint brands that I use, and the color range is definitely part of that. Big cons for me. So the big one, they're all brought over from America, which as such does incur some costs. So, for example, if I switch back to the US store for a minute here, you can see these are $3.69 in dollars, but in pounds they are almost no cheaper at all. So they're quite an expensive paint to begin with at $3.69 a pot, and by UK standards, even compared to brands like GW, they are expensive. Now, they're a just under 15mm pot, so you do get a bit more paint than GW. They do, I find, go a very long way. I've been using Reaper as my main paint brand for a year now, and I've replaced one bottle and it was black. And you have to bear in mind, I'm a professional painter. I paint every single day. So, you know, the cost difference, it could well matter to you. To me, I've found it to be okay because they do last. But the cost is definitely a big con. The second is they don't tend to be as readily available in LGSs in England. So you do tend to have to be willing to go and find them, which is obviously, you know, you're probably going to have to order online, basically. The other big con with Reaper, and I've got to say it, it pains me to say it, but I've got to, the metallics are so hit and miss, and the bad ones are absolutely awful. Like, some of them are just really, really not very good paints. And don't get me wrong, they have some fantastic metallics. There's one called Dragon Bronze, which is the most glittery, sparkly gold you'll ever lay eyes on. Incredible. But they also have some that just do not cover. By the time they do cover, they're incredibly streaky. They cannot be thinned. Just a lot of problems with them. So, to summarise, Reaper, pros, very nice matte finish, very good fluidity out of the bottle. Cons, quite pricey, not very good metallics. Which now conveniently brings me into the other main brand that I use, which is the Scale Colour range from Scale 75. I'm not big on their fantasy and games range, which are their satin paints. As I've said, I tend to prefer matte paints. So the fantasy and games range tends to not be the one for me. It tends to be the Scale Colour range. However, they are so bloody good. So you can get them direct like this in sets. You can also buy individual pots from LGSs. There is a major LGS, I can say it, Element Games. Element Games, they sell Scale 75. And these are my other main brand of paint. So, pros and cons. Pros, the prices are reasonable. You'll pay about, you know, just under £3 for a bottle of normal paint, just under £4 for a bottle of metallic paint, which these days is about what you expect to pay. It's a little bit pricey, but all of the sort of quality brands are about that price, so we forgive it. So the price is reasonable. The main pros, again, very, very matte. Actually, for me personally, too matte on a lot of the colours. Some of the colours can look a bit chalky. And so you have to be very, very careful with Scale. Sometimes I find they just need a little dab of satin varnish over the top or a little bit of ink over the top just to bring some satin back to them, because they are very, very matte. To the point that the surface will look a bit dusty on some of them. However, the thing I love about them, they use a really thick gel medium, and it is designed for you to thin right down to a glaze. These paints are really made with glazing in mind. So if you need to do colour filtering or recess glazing, any of that kind of counter shading, using a complementary colour, that sort of thing, they're really, really nice for it. They'll go in very subtly, they'll build up very nicely, and because of the extremely heavy gel pigment that they use, that pigment is still going to hold even when they're thinned to absolute high heaven. So for the applications that they excel in, they're brilliant. But for your general everyday paint range, I probably couldn't recommend them. However, the massive pro with Scale 75 is it's got to be their metallics range. Their metallics range is incredible. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a couple of clangers in there. There's definitely a couple that you need to watch out for. But with that said, the ones that are good, which is the majority of them, I mean, I'm talking Elven Gold, Necrotic Gold, Victorian Brass. Oh God, I've got them behind me. I could start listing the ones that are beautiful. There's this one, Decayed Metal, incredible. Decayed Metal is one of my favourite ones. Heavy Metal, Black Metal. There are so many incredible metallics in that range, and maybe one or two that aren't that great. Speed Metal is the main one that I would say to avoid. You see a bunch of people using it. I don't really know why people favour it, to be honest. It's very, very hard to work with. Doesn't like covering, doesn't like sitting nicely on the surface of the miniature. Clags up really quickly on the palette. Yeah, some metallics dry up quicker than others, so that's one that dries up at lightning speed. So yeah, I'm gonna say big pros for Scale 75, good color range, lovely matte finish, incredible metallics. Pros for Scale 75 are too matte for some people, definitely. A little bit hard to work with because of that heavy gel medium. They do the non-metallic colors, they do want to be thinned quite a lot, and you've got to find the sweet spot with them before they become easy to use. But yeah, Scale 75, just really the main con is just that they're not super easy to work with. They ask you to feel them out and to learn what they want from you and to work with them. And once you get good with them, you can do some really stunning stuff, but they are a bit hard to work with. So let's head back to the face cam and we'll talk a bit more about materials. So, not much of a clear conclusion on paints, I'm afraid. Probably not what you wanted to hear, but paints are a bit of a use what works best for you scenario. GW paints are fine, they're just a bit pricey. You know, Vallejo paints are fantastic, but sometimes their super high coverage is not great for everybody. My personal favourites are Reaper and Scale 75, and that's because I like the way they finish. I like the way they go on. I know how to work with them. All in all, paints are really going to come down to what you most prefer. The only thing I would say when it comes to paints is don't default to GW just because they're the most common. There may be something out there that works better for you. There may be something out there that you actually like more once you start working with it. Try other brands, see what's out there, see what works for you. However, we can now get into a few more slightly black and white things, some things that are a bit easier to objectively review. So let's talk next about brushes. So these tend to be a bit of a point of contention because there is an element of use what works for you. You know, people, they develop a feeling for brushes, but I think that's true of all materials. When you make these material recommendation videos and such like, when you recommend materials to people in general, I think what you should be doing is caveating your recommendations with, you probably will have to get used to working with something that isn't the thing that you've got used to working with, right? So we're going to kind of just try and treat this on as much of a level playing field as possible. Again, I'm going to start with the common ones. Games Workshop brushes have for the longest time been super popular with miniature painters, and the reason they're super popular with miniature painters is because you can buy them right there in the store, and most miniature painters go to the store quite regularly, right? And I really do believe the accessibility of GW's brushes is one of the things that makes them so popular. So let's talk about it. Complete brush set, £118.25, and in this we get a lot of redundancy. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different rounds. These are essentially rounds. We've got 1 filbert, 2 angles, 3 flats. We've got the thing that's like a cheapo version of a colour shaper. I've actually got one of these myself. It is fine. It is fine. It's just not really worth the asking price. This is a colour shaper, by the way. A colour shaper is basically the same thing. And then we've got a couple of big old hog brushes. So if we talk about these as we would normal brushes, we've got a whole bunch of redundancy, because the truth is, and this is something that a few people are going to struggle to be okay with, you do not need tiny rounds for for any of your miniature painting, really. The smallest brush you need is a size 1. Now, I know that's going to upset a few people. I know that's going to be a little bit controversial for some people. I know some people are not going to want to hear that because they're very attached to their tiny brushes. But things like GW's extra small artificer brush, for example, this one. Things like their, where is it? Is that the only one they do these days? Or I think that's actually the only one they do these days. So yeah, things like the extra small and the small artificer brushes, you really don't need them. You really, really don't. A good quality brush should hold a fine enough point that the end of the brush is small enough to paint an eye or a single strand of hair or a fingernail or anything that you may need to paint. What small brushes do is inhibit your development of brush control through muscle memory. So using these tiny little tiny little pinpoint brushes doesn't help you as a painter. Really, really holds you back as a painter. So when we look at the Games Workshop brush range, what we see is we see a lot of brushes for a start, which is no surprise. They're a big commercial supplier and they're going to want to put a lot of products on the market so as to maximize the ways in which they can make money off of you. You know, it makes sense. However, the problem is that for miniature painting, you just don't need all of these things. You just don't. This 2-inch terrain painting brush, these two brushes, the one that's for tanks and the one that's for terrain, these are super cheap brushes. You would never ever buy GW's versions of these with any common sense, and I don't think most painters do. I think the ones that most painters buy are these ones, the ones that are in the Essentials collection. So what we've got here is a wedge, a flat, and 3 different rounds, and comparatively they look like a double O, an O. No, actually I'd say an O and a 1. This one actually looks like it might be not a round. It looks like it might be a flat pointed brush, but this one's definitely a round. So it looks like what we've probably got here is a 0, a 1 and a 2. And I would probably ditch all of these and just have a 1 and a 2. A 2 is generally good for just covering big surfaces quickly, and a 1 will paint even the finest of details. So that brings me to my 2 big cons with GW's brush range. The price is ridiculous. This brush at £16.50 is frankly a joke. It is an insult, and I could never come up with a justifiable argument for owning one. The other is the quality. GW brushes just don't last. They start to split and splay and go in all sorts of directions very, very quickly, almost as soon as you start using them. I mean, I've had GW brushes that have been unusable after 1 miniature, and it's not okay. It is not okay. I really cannot even give a single pro to their brush range. I like their paints, but their brushes, I cannot even give a single pro to. They are too expensive for the quality. I mean, these ones, the non-Artificer ones, these are the ones that break almost immediately. The Artificer ones are slightly better quality, but they're still not as good a quality as their rivals, and they're still 1.5 times the price of the next cheapest rival. It's just not, it's not good enough. So GW, the quick conclusion is just don't use their brushes. Just do not paint with their brushes. You are only hurting yourself. So let's go on to the next most common brush range, which is Army Painter. Again, unfortunately, Army Painter do suffer from the we make too many brushes problem. Now, I don't think that you can paint everything on a miniature with 1 brush. I'm not one of those people. And I don't really think that you should only have a small number of brushes in your collection. What I think you should have in your collection is redundancy. I think you should have a lot of brushes in stock that do the same jobs, and that is so that you are never left in a position where a brush dies in the middle of a piece and you're forced to try and get to the end of that piece with a crappy brush. But the truth of the matter is, pretty much everything you paint on a miniature you can do with a couple of brushes. So you know, I generally buy 1s, 2s and 3s. My 3s I'll buy synthetics, my 1s and 2s I'll buy sable. And what I do is, as my 3s start to get crappy, I'll then cut them down short. You should be able to see this one that I've done that with. And this is actually an Army Painter brush, funny enough. As my 3s get crappy, I cut them down short and these become my dry brushes. And they function identically to any dry brush that you would buy from a shop. I mean, I have a GW dry brush here, and it's exactly the same deal. So I don't really see the point in buying dry brushes. when you need to do big things like tanks and stuff like that, I can definitely understand going out and getting a couple of bigger brushes specifically for that application. But that's probably for the areas that you're going to want to cover fast. So you're probably just buying a couple of cheap synthetic brushes, getting those big coverage areas done, and then going back to your small brushes to do all of the detailed work that you've got to slow down and take your time with anyway. So with that in mind, again, a bit of a problem with a lot of these miniature painting companies, the specialist hobby related companies, that they just make too many bloody brushes. Army Painter's prices, much more reasonable. They are much more reasonable. Their brushes are of a better standard of quality than the GW brushes and are cheaper than the GW brushes. So if something is both higher in quality and costs less, it would seem like a no-brainer. And I think that's why the majority of people that rebel against the GW ecosystem and refuse to buy their brushes tend to land on Army Painter. And I've noticed this, it's a very, very common thing in the hobby world. Most people decide that GW brushes aren't good value for money, and rightly so, and then instantly land into Army Painter. And unfortunately, what they never learn, what they never get the chance to experience firsthand, is that they're actually still getting a pretty bum deal. So issues with Army Painter, again, we have things like the Psycho brush. We don't need a brush with 3 hairs on the end of it. It is useless to us as miniature painters. Absolutely useless. It doesn't hold enough moisture in those bristles to stay wet long enough to do anything more than maybe 1 stroke before it's dried out. And that isn't useful for miniature painting. You need to be able to go in and make a correction, or, you know, add a second layer quickly, that kind of thing. You can't be using brushes that the paint dries up on instantly. However, that said, all of that said, for a reasonable brush, for a middle of the road brush, you can do worse than Army Painter. So, pros, cheaper than GW, very easily available. You can get them everywhere. You can get them straight off their website, you can get them off Amazon, you can get them in LGS's, loads of LGS's stock Army Painter these days, bloody loads of them. Their paints, I will tell you, are really poor quality. Really, really poor quality. Their washes are fantastic. Their brushes are okay. That is my honest feelings on their general product range. I think great washes, terrible paints, fine brushes. But, like I say, the cons of the brushes are that they will lure you into buying brushes that you don't need, and the quality is still not amazing. It is okay, but it's not amazing. They don't last that much longer than GW brushes. So, let's get on to the next logical conclusion. Winsor & Newton Series 7. Now, Winsor & Newton Series 7 are actually a bit of a problem. They're a bit of a problem because they are, when they're good, an incredible paintbrush. They are such a good paintbrush. They last an unbelievably long time. They hold an extremely fine point, to the point that even a size 1, even a size 2 in my experience, can paint any detail on a miniature, no matter how fine. But the quality control is so inconsistent on them. I have had orders, because Winsor were my standard brush for quite a long time. Winsor Series 7s, these exact brushes you see on screen now, were the brushes that I was using every day for quite a long time. And the problem was that your order would arrive in the post. Obviously, like I say, I'm a professional painter. I paint every day. Now, let's say I buy 5 size 1s and 3 size 2s, for example. That's a pretty normal order for me, and I'd expect that to last me probably about 4 to 6 months. That would be, you know, about what I'd be buying little ancillary things in between, but I would expect that, you know, to last me about 4 to 6 months. I should get about a month out of a good quality brush using it every single day and ragging it. And the problem I would have is, of my 5 Winsor & Newtons, 2 or 3 of them would be unusably damaged in their packaging. And they'd still have the brush protector on them. They'd still be sealed in the little cellophane thing. They've literally come from the factory like that. And because it's such a known thing amongst art suppliers how inconsistent the quality is on Winsor & Newton Series 7s. A lot of art suppliers are really hard work for getting refunds back from on Winsor & Newton brushes as well. I've had art suppliers, and I'm not going to name names here. This is not a scandal video. I'm not trying to call anyone out before anybody asks me to. But I've had art suppliers insist that the damage was caused in the post, for example, when it still has its plastic brush protector on it and it's still in its wrapper. But they would insist that the damage was caused in the post. It wasn't. Nothing could have possibly got in there to splay those bristles and spread them out while it still has a brush protector and a plastic wrapper on it. And this is the problem, is that Winsor & Newton, unfortunately, are known, they are notorious in the art supply industry for having very, very inconsistent quality control. And I'm sorry, but when a size 1 brush is £11, that becomes completely unacceptable. That becomes just absolutely out the window. Now, don't get me wrong. Assuming that you have a good quality Winsor Series 7, if you buy a 1 and a 2, all of your miniature painting needs are going to be covered, and you're going to have a very beautifully good quality paintbrush. If you've got a good one, it's going to be incredible. You're going to have a really, really easy time with it. You're going to really enjoy working with it. And it's going to be fantastic. But if you get a bad one, it's going to be unusable. You're literally going to take it out of the packet and it's going to look like a bloody fan. It's going to look like a palm tree. And that is not what you want from a paintbrush that costs 11 quid. £11, people. And if you're in America watching this, all of these things are also available to you in America. The pricing that I'm using is not going to be accurate, but all of these materials are still available in America. I very deliberately chose things to talk about that are easy to get in America as well. So, Winsor & Newton, pros, incredible brushes. Absolutely amazing, wonderful, incredible brushes. Cons, they're not very consistent on quality control, and they are so expensive. So unbelievably expensive. Now then, here's the secret weapon. Now, this is a fairly recent discovery for me. I only stumbled upon these a couple of months ago, but they have been unbelievable since I started using them. That is Rosemary & Co. These are a British company, Derbyshire based, I believe, which is quite close to where I live. And the prices would make you believe that you are buying a very average brush. The prices would make you believe that you are not going to get anything special for your money. Do not be fooled by price. That's the big takeaway. Do not be fooled by price. These Rosemary & Co. Series 33s. They're actually an oil painting brush, which tells you straight away that they are designed to handle a paint that is more abusive to brushes. So that's already a good sign. Winsor & Newton Series 7s are a watercolor brush. They are designed to handle a paint that is very easy on brushes, which is one of the reasons they don't keep very well. Series 33, pure Kolinsky pointed. This is the brush to go for. And look at these prices. £5.35 for a size 1. Let's compare that to Games Workshop. Medium Artificer would be about a size 1, I would say. I would say like a 1, a 0 and a 00 is probably roughly what these translate to. So we'll say Medium Artificer, £16.50. Army Painter, they have, I think it's this Precise Detail. This is a synthetic, so that wouldn't be, is this all of their brushes? No, they have more. Wargamer, oh no they don't. They don't actually sell any more of their brushes through their website. They used to do a nice Kolinsky detail brush, but it looks like they don't anymore. So we don't have a direct comparison because their Precise Detail, which would be about the same size, is synthetic, not Kolinsky. So we can't really make a comparison. However, what we can say is that we're getting Kolinsky Sable for only £2 more. So that's quite a thing. We can definitely say that. We're getting Kolinsky Sable for only £2 more. Winsor & Newton, double the price. It's a no-brainer, isn't it? £5.35. I cannot stress enough. Check out Rosemary & Co. brushes because it's just all upside. The quality is fantastic. They last a really long time. They hold an incredible point. The presentation when they arrive in the post is beautiful. It will bring tears to your eyes. If brush porn exists, it is when you receive your Rosemary & Co. delivery. they're cheap, they're readily available. There's just so many pros, and literally I have not found a single con. I've been painting with them every single day for 3 months now, and I cannot find a single bad thing about them. A size 1 lasts me about a month, a size 2 lasts me about 2 months. They're just bang on. So brushes, quick roundup. GW, bad. Army Painter, okay. Windsor, inconsistent but incredible when they're good. Rosemary & Co, I can't find a fault. I mean, guys, I've been painting 25 years. I've been through some brush brands, and I cannot find a single thing bad about them. So my conclusion for brushes, Rosemary & Co. They're the ones to go for. And the final tool that I want to talk to you about today is the wet palette. Wet palettes are a thing that a lot of painters go through most of their painting journey never even realizing why they should use one. I myself only started using a wet palette 2-3 years ago. Not that long when you consider that I've been painting since 1992. It's, you know, it's a pretty long chunk of my painting journey spent never knowing any better. The truth is, wet palettes really do help your painting. They help it fantastically. They make your paints last longer, go further, perform better. They just make them nicer to handle. But knowing what wet palette to put your time and or money into is a minefield. It can be so difficult to figure out. So I'm going to go over again the most common types of wet palette. We're going to have a chat about that, and my conclusion may shock you. That's clickbaity, isn't it? Let's find out more. Okay, final thing I want to talk about today then. Wet palettes. These, I see the most arguments on the internet because of these bloody things. So I'm just going to try and lay this out for you as evenly as possible so that you can make a bit more of an informed decision. Okay, so the first thing you almost always see, no matter where you go, no matter what you look at, is make your own wet palette. It's super cheap, okay? Great idea. And nowadays people are starting to cotton on to these Swedish cloths, cellulose cloths, which are so much better than tissue paper, and that you can actually make a pretty good performing wet palette yourself from these household items. So let's assume you have to buy these. Let's assume, you know, for the sake of fairness, let's assume you have to buy the materials to make them. So your Tupperware tub is essentially free. Everyone's going to have a Tupperware tub at home, so we can discount that. These are £8 a pack for free. I'll show you more on that later. Roll of parchment paper is going to be about £2. So you're basically talking about a tenner to make a palette yourself. Okay, so your obvious pro, very cheap. Your cons are, you've got to do some work yourself. That's a very small con. Your other con is a bit of a massive one, and it's something that a lot of people in the hobby just really struggle to get their heads around. This product, parchment paper, is not designed to control the amount of water that it lets through it. That is not its design intent. Its intent is to create a non-stick barrier between a wet surface and a dry surface, so as to allow, you know, a cake or whatever to be released from a tin without sticking to it. So the idea of this is that it should be low adhesion enough that it will peel off of a cake, and therefore when you line a tin with it, you can get your cake out. Now the issue with that is that every single different brand of parchment paper you use is going to perform in different ways. Suddenly go to the grocery store and can't get your preferred parchment paper one week, you're stuffed. Your palette's going to start behaving completely differently. You've got the annoyance of cutting it to size. That actually is much more of an issue than the making of the palette itself. Your choice is to either sit down for like an hour and pre-cut a load of sheets, or cut them to order, both of which are really tedious. Most people are going to be willing to do it to save a lot of money, but in all honesty, it's not really the best palette anyway. Parchment paper, it just does not quite perform as well. You tend to find one of two things. Either parchment paper lets too much water through and your paints are going to be much wetter than you're used to them being, which is going to make working with them really difficult. or your parchment paper doesn't let enough water through and your paints are not going to actually last much longer on that wet palette than they would if they were on a dry palette, because they're barely getting any additional hydration. Now, a lot of people won't care. A lot of people will be absolutely fine with that. And that's okay. If you want to make your wet palette, make your wet palette, but just understand that there are those limitations, those problems. That's fine. We now have to still talk about the wet palettes that you can buy, because some people are just not going to want to make their wet palette. They're going to want to buy one. So let's talk about the common ones, the ones that people usually buy. The big one that everyone seems to love is the Redgrass one. It looks lovely. It comes with this little well palette beside it. It's got the little band to keep it shut. It's very cool. It's very cute. It's also tiny. Now they do a bigger one, but it's nearly 40 quid. This one is very, very small. It's really, really impractically small for me. Your mileage may vary. You may find that the size isn't an issue for you, but it is absolutely impractically small for me. I have just nightmares trying to get through a painting session on this palette. I owned it. I used it every day. I liked how small its footprint was on my desk. I liked how little desk space it took up, but I was just constantly filling it. The other issue with the Redgrass palette is the paper is terrible. And I'm so sorry to Redgrass Games. If any of you somehow see this, it goes, so with a wet palette, when you lay two colours on it, you lay them beside each other and then you start to sort of scrub them together to mix them. That's very normal kind of wet palette use. The problem with the Redgrass palette is the paper releases little bubbles into your paint when you start scrubbing the colours together. So as soon as you sort of rub against the paper, it starts to release these little woolly bubbles into your paint. And then you paint onto something and you've got this little bobbly bit in it. And you're like, where did that come from? My paints are all smooth. And, you know, it will drive you wild. For weeks when I was using this thing, I was trying to figure out why suddenly my paint kept going bitty. I was like, what's going on with my paint? Is it drying out? Is it, you know, the surface is drying and then I'm mixing it back into the wet paint underneath? What's happening? Eventually figured out it was the paper. Really just not usable for me. Not usable. If you're trying to achieve any standard of quality in your painting, you can't have that. You cannot have a wet palette that ruins your paint. So for me, this one is instantly stricken off the list. Now the Army Painter one is the next one. It is, so I've never owned this one. It is slightly cheaper than the Redgrass palette. It's 20 quid instead of 26 quid. However, it's the same size, which gives it the same major con. I can't comment for its actual usability because I don't own it, but I know that it's very popular. I know that a lot of people were excited for it to come out. I have heard on the rumour mill that it is a clone of the Redgrass palette. Therefore, it will suffer the same drawbacks as the Redgrass palette. If that is true, if it is a clone of the Redgrass palette, I cannot possibly recommend it. But the Army Painter one, it is a bit cheaper. It does have this, you know, cool little sort of dry palette insert with these little bitty bobbies, and you know, there are some cool little pros to the Army Painter palette. It's not a bad little looking bit of kit, but in all honesty, it is still tiny and therefore very hard for me to recommend. The next one, the one that I used to recommend a lot when I first started getting into wet palettes, is the Frisk Keep Wet palette. Again, it's 20 quid, but it's double the size of the other two. It's the same size as the Studio XL palette from Redgrass. It's massive. I have one right on my desk in front of me, and I'm going to get on to why that is important in a minute. I actually don't recommend this palette anymore. But I also kind of do. So it's a tricky one, the Frisk palette. It has the best keep wet paper, the best top paper I have ever seen in my life. The performance is incredible. It keeps your paints wet for a long time. It doesn't let too much water through. It doesn't go bobbly. It only wrinkles and curls as much as any other wet palette paper. You know, it's not any worse than any other wet palette paper. It's obviously massive, it's pre-cut. These are all really good things. The problem with it is that the bottom layer is essentially just a sheet of blotting paper. it holds water for no time at all. It holds water for maybe a couple of hours in the summer, and then the palette will just dry out. If you run a fan, it dries out even faster. Like if there's a fan blowing over your painting area, it's just a nightmare. The bottom paper is awful. So here's where we get to my conclusion. If you don't mind a small palette, go for and you don't want to make one, go for the Army Painter or the Red Grass by all means. They're fine palettes. You know, they have their problems. They may annoy you, but if you have your heart set on those palettes, buy them. It's your money. I would advise you not to set your heart on those palettes though. My main issue obviously being the size, but also with the Red Grass, the top paper. There is something you can do which is very, very good and is not a lot of money. So this palette is 20 quid, okay? These Swedish dishcloths that we talked about, which people are starting to use in their homemade wet palettes now, are £7.82. So you can buy a Frisk wet palette and a pack of these Swedish dishcloths for £27.82, which is about the same price as the tiny Red Grass palette, as this small orange and grey one. The other one's blue and grey. So for about the same money, you know, literally £2 more, £1.82 more, whatever, you know. You can buy a pack of these Scandi cloths from Amazon, biodegradable cellulose sponge cleaning cloths, and you can buy a Frisk wet palette. Now 3 of these, which is what you get in a pack, I believe. I think you get 3. Yeah, 3-pack blue. Yeah, 3 of these will line the Frisk wet palette twice over. So 1.5 of these will line the Frisk wet palette. This is what I do, so I know that this is true because this is my palette that I use every day. The refills for the Frisk palette happen to be very, very cheap. So they are, you can actually get them cheaper than this. They normally cost me about £3. So I won't sit here and look for them. Ah, there we go. Frisk Keep Wet Palette Refill Pack. There you go, £3.30. So the refills for the Frisk palette are actually really, really cheap. And like I said, this top paper that they use for their palette is brilliant. It's so good. So if you are using the Frisk system, the actual upkeep costs are really, really cheap. It's brilliant. And because it's a big palette, you won't need to change your paper as often anyway. However, throw away the crappy card that it comes with for the bottom layer. Grab yourself a pack of these. These hold water for days at a time. I'm not joking. I'm not joking. I've literally had the same wet palette running for like 3-4 days straight, using it every day without changing either the top paper or the bottom cloths. They are that good. They hold water for ages. Even in the summer, they'll be absolutely fine. They are brilliant. So for me, the best mix of pros is to use the size and price advantage of the Frisk palette along with its fantastic top paper, but get rid of its crappy bottom paper and replace it with the cellulose sponges that you would use in a homemade palette. That gives you the best of all worlds. And going back to the homemade palette, one of the other problems with the homemade palette is that you don't tend to have access to large Tupperware dishes. This would be an even smaller working area than the 2 palettes that I said are too small for me. So this really is the Frisk palette with the super Scandi cloths it's the best of all worlds. You get to sort of feel like you've homemade your palette. You know, you get to pat yourself on the back for not overly subscribing to any one given thing, which I know seems to matter to some people. I don't know why, but it matters to some people. But you also get to actually have the performance benefits of all of the best things. You get to have the great massive sized palette. You get to have the super long lasting bottom cloth. The bottom cloths for both the Army Painter and Red Grass palettes are cellulose, by the way. So that's where this notion comes from, that that's a good material to use on the bottom. So you get to have the best bottom cloth, you get to have the best top paper, you get to have the largest size, your upkeep costs are cheap, and you're only paying £2 more than the Red Grass palette. That to me is a no-brainer. So my recommendation for wet palettes: buy a Frisk palette, toss out the bottom paper, get some Scandi cloths. You've done it. You've lived the dream. So there you have it. A collection of my thoughts on the 3 most common things that we use as miniature painters paints, brushes, and a palette. In this case, we decided to talk about a wet palette. Now, this is something that I actually want to start doing as a bit of a series, maybe once a month, something like that. So please, I implore you, give me your feedback in the comments. Tell me what you think of my thoughts and feelings on these products. More than happy to discuss it with people. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.